Great. We are live. So, hello everyone, and welcome. My name is Francesca Lattesi, and I work for Climate Action Network International. On behalf of the organizing committee, which is composed of the Asian People's Movement on Depth and Development, Climate Action Network International, the Women and Gender Constituency, and the Youth Constituency at the UNFCCC, I would like to welcome all of you, the distinguished experts, the panel, and all of those joining us online to our event towards BAM, the public hearing on the Just Transition Mechanism. For the past few years, civil society has been engaging intensively on just transition at global climate conferences as a means to ensure that all aspects of climate action embrace the needs for securing rights and justice for workers, indigenous people, and communities, and support all countries in their efforts to find pathways for their people's prosperity. COP30 constituted a major landmark for advancing justice, equity, and rights through just transition. A decision was taken outlining key principles that must be taken into account when advancing just transition. And on top of that, and critical to civil society demands, it committed to develop for decision in 2026 a just transition mechanism that will make all of those principles and aspects to be materialized. Our groups outlined several demands regarding the mechanism, which we have called the BAM, that now stands for the Belém Antalya mechanism for just transition. And as we prepare for the next round of the negotiations, we really wanted to hear from experts and practitioners well beyond our constituency groups, their thoughts on how we can make the just transition mechanism work, learning from past experiences from their work, and also accelerating good work happening on the ground. And we decided that instead of holding those conversations privately, we wanted to actually hold them publicly and for the benefit of a much larger audience. And that's why we're also live streaming these sessions, and they will be stored on YouTube. And in this third hearing of the day, we are very honored to be joined by Boitumelo Molete and Lebogang Mulaisi from the South African Presidential Commission on Climate Change. I'll give a little introduction, but we have with us Boitumelo Molete. This is the Social Development Policy Coordinator at the Congress of South African Trade Union, COSATU, co-leading work on climate change and the just transition for the biggest labor federation in South Africa. She serves as an organized labor commissioner in the Presidential Climate Commission and represents organized labor at National Economic Development and Labor Council. Boitumelo also serves on the UNEP Green Jobs for Youth Pact Advisory Group, the Presidential Just Energy Transition Funding Platform, and the Department of Higher Education and Training That Skills Advisory Forum. And we also are honored to have with us Lebogang, which is the executive manager responsible for policy and research in the Presidential Climate Commission. She previously served on the commission as a commissioner representing labor and as chief operations officer in the secretariat. She was previously the head of policy at COSATU, responsible for labor market policy and the just transition. Through engagements with labor unions, she has developed a blueprint for workers on the mechanisms to transition to a low carbon economy through collective bargaining. So again, we really wanted to thank both of you to join us. And we'll hear a brief presentation from both of you, but I also wanted to take a moment to introduce the rest of the panelists that we have here, because the presentation will be followed by an interactive exchange with representatives from civil society. And in this session, we have Carmen Wabnitz from the Youth Constituency at the UNFCCC. We have Caroline Veillet from Canada, from Cannes, Felicitus Okoko from the Women and Gender Constituency, and Kuda Mandongo from PowerSheet Africa, Cannes. But first, we really want to hear from both of you about your work, experiences, and then we can build on that for the conversation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction. It's quite a pleasure to be invited by CAN International to share our perspective from the South African side, but also as people that have been quite involved in the UNFCCC processes, representing workers through the trade union NGO Tungo. So we're quite happy to be here to share our own experiences that are very much related to South Africa's discourse. So just by a way of introduction and just to centralize this discussion, it's very important that we are quite clear that we must do everything that we can within the constraints to which climate impacts us to ensure that our economy is competitive and is creating opportunities for everyone in South Africa. In that context, we are lifting up the importance of ensuring that we are taking our people out of what we call the triple challenges that are faced by South Africans. This includes poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So our goal through the Just Transition discourse in South Africa is to ensure that we are addressing and redressing the issues to which South Africans have been faced with through the years of transitioning from a very oppressive state to a more democratic state. And we believe that the just transition and the impact to which we are able to touch on these will be our measure to which we see if this transition is actually just and is actually inclusive. We sit at a very disadvantageous position as South Africans in South Africa. Like I mentioned, the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. We find that over 50% of people are living in poverty in South Africa with a Gini coefficient of 0.63, as well as unemployment at plus 30%. This is quite a clear picture of how it is that inequality is actually quite part of South Africa. And it is important that we frame our thinking from that perspective as a global South country to note that there are several other issues outside of transitioning to a low carbon economy that affect us, that are socioeconomic, and that we need to address through wanting to achieve a just and equitable transition. It's also very important for us to note as this sitting to note that, I mean, while we continue to call for a just and equitable transition, a just transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy, we want it at a pace that our country can afford and in a manner to which will ensure that we are achieving energy security and energy democracy. It's very important to note that even in the recent President's State of the Nation address, the President centers issues of energy quite strongly in the South African context. It's also important to note that we have quite a strong political will to address issues of energy in South Africa, and that our President, through the presidency and various institutions, including the Presidential Climate Commission, where I sit in as a commissioner, we have had the president center the issues of energy, and we've had the president actually mandate various institutions, various departments in government to be able to achieve a just and equitable transition. While we see the PCC with a newly elected cohort of commissioners, as well as institutions like the project management unit that sits at the presidency level, that is the one that is addressing issues of implementation of the just transition. We see institutions like the Just Energy Transition Funding Platform being established by the presidency, as well as the recently established Just Energy Transition Skills Advisory chapter, which has an advisory forum where I represent workers as well. So there are quite a number of institutions that show and illustrate that the state is actually willing to engage on these issues at a multi-stakeholder level, and that our president is looking and is having an oversight to ensure that this actually takes place with equipped professionals and equipped technical people that are leading this discussion, including people like Ms. Mulaisi on the call. It's also very important that we acknowledge the work that the Presidential Climate Commission has done. We have what we call a framework for a just transition in South Africa that was consolidated through multi-stakeholder consultation and engagements. This framework starts to build how South Africa sees the just transition to be like. It also seeks to achieve the prospects of seeing the the future to a low carbon economy and seeks an equitable distribution of risks and responsibilities in the context of the historical liabilities of climate catastrophe. We took an all-inclusive approach, and I say we as a representative of organized labor, and as you have said, I represent the biggest federation in Southern Africa, COSATU. The inclusive approach is that we need to involve everyone at the level of decision making that is able to kind of come together so that there is some sort of social compacting and social agreement. This approach actually assists us to have kind of an active support to how workers and communities are affected by these mitigation measures, but also that they are informing these measures and they are informing us as to what it is that is required to move to a low carbon and climate resilient economy for them. We acknowledge that there are quite a lot of shifts that will take place that are economic as well as physical, that of the impacts of climate change. So we're quite sure that we need to center this around the people. While science is very important, the South African just transition discourse is very much centered on ensuring that all of the socioeconomic elements of the just transition are also accommodated for. And you also see that in a lot of the work that COSATU does in terms of policy and policy framing, where you see the blueprints that you mentioned, Ms. Mulaisi was part of consolidating, speaks to how it is that workers foresee and envision this climate resilient economy and how they are able to participate. So we use opportunities that are created by the transition to structurally change the economy. That is what we're here for. And we put to the table assets and resources to ensure that those that are previously disadvantaged are not left behind. This, I think, should be noted that includes women, so a gender element, as well as young people. In the PCC, there are various constituencies that are represented, including youth, including women, as well as other institutions of civil society and faith-based organizations. So while this is a structural economic change, it's also one that is informed by the people and is for the people. So the Just Transition Framework attempts to define the transition, all right, and systematically lays out the consideration of a transition. Just to go through what the Just Transition Framework sees, it has a vision where we want to define our transition, where it is a collective vision. We have quite a lot of principles that we present, where we addressing issues like what are the boundaries or constraints that a framework can address and how we can actually ensure that we have procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. At the risk groups, we are here the framework best wants to empower risk groups, which are people that are mostly vulnerable. We want to see what strategies must be employed over the short, medium, and long term to ensure a just and equitable transition. There's a lot of planning elements that are identified. These are elements that must be considered when we're putting together a just transition plan, as well as, quite importantly, policy measures where we are able to link and achieve our visions through a just transition framework. The principles identified for just transition are quite focused and really speak to three justices that the framework that the PCC has consolidated speak to. These are distributive justice, where we speak about equitable distribution of risk and responsibilities, addressing direct impacts of the transition. Restorative justice very much speaks to redressing of the historical damages in order to rectify or eliminate situations. The procedural justice element speaks about empowering workers, communities, as well as small businesses so that they can define their own development and shape how decision makers actually respond to their needs. So it's important to realize that the just transition has several areas of planning, and these are simultaneous. So there's an element of labor market where COSATU quite strongly has contributed towards speaking to and also advocates on the sidelines, including in the UNFCCC processes, the importance of ensuring that issues of skilling, reskilling, and upskilling are addressed adequately, that we're speaking to how it is we can actually empower workers to be able to participate in a low carbon and climate resilient economy. That's a mandate that the Congress of South African trade unions has to ensure that the elements of skills and ensuring that workers are part of this process is quite strongly finds expression strongly. We also want to align the basic and higher education element into the future of work, into the future economy. You will see that South Africa strongly believes in skills as you look through the skills chapter of our just transition discourse and how we've invested time and effort to identify professionals as well as technical people to be able to inform this. And this will find its expression in a lot of the PCC's work, but also in other elements of institutions the state has identified. Further to this, we want to see this being an employment incentive and job placement activity. And what COSATU also identifies in terms of that is to ensure that these jobs, according to the international standards, are not only just jobs created, these are decent jobs with a decent wage where workers will have sustainable livelihoods and they'll be able to provide for themselves. The element of the labor market, I think, also speaks quite strongly to the fears that workers have in terms of the potential of job losses. This is quite important to have a background thinking of when we are speaking to the element of planning towards the labor market and the just transition. A further one for South Africa, and a very important one, is the one on economic diversification. So we want to see infrastructure and incentives to support new economic clusters. We know that with the various decommissioning and moving from fossil fuels, there will be a lot of a need for us to identify that not only are there issues of jobs and the labor market, but there are issues of the economy in its entirety. This for us as COSATU also includes the provisions for the informal economy and workers that are outside of the formal structures. And I think the chapter on economic diversification really speaks to how small and local businesses can have support mechanisms so that they're able to function and that they're not left to destitute. This also is in support of low carbon and climate resilient innovation. So we quite strongly believe that localization is finding expression in this economic diversification chapter and is one that can uplift collaborations between communities and formal labor structures. The part on social support is important. We speak about issues of ensuring that social support for displaced workers and those that would take early retirements are actually taken in for consideration and provisions. Looking towards also achieving a basic income support for those who are unemployed, because we all know that unemployment leaves people with no resources or means to live. So it's very important that we not only consider the formally employed, but also those that are in the communities that are unemployed. It's also very important that through social support and the provisions and planning for this, we address issues of universal access to basic services, including healthcare and sustainable human settlements. On governance, it's important to enable and have a regulatory role of national, provincial, as well as local government. This is to make sure that through the various stratas of government, there are parts to which we are enabling for regulation to take place, corporate governance within the context of ESG and climate disclosure, inclusive multi-stakeholder governance and ways to leverage capacity of social partners is very important, as well as how to measure impact and success when it comes to just transition and climate action. One that is very important to trade unions and to South Africa, not exclusively, but quite important, is the issue of climate finance. We center as the trade union climate finance from the Paris Agreement, where we see that it was quite clear that the global north needed to come to the table and assist the global south to transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. And we have our preamble from there as the trade union. It finds expression in the framework to see how important it is to tackle flows of climate finance into the just transition, where we are establishing a dedicated just transition financing mechanism, and that we scale up grant financing with green bonds and blended finance instruments. You will note that in the discourse and how COSATU, as well as the International Trade Union Confederation, has placed the discussion on climate finance is to say that we really are looking to have more grants than we do loans. We're looking to have more finance that is developmental in nature and finance that actually touches the people. Issues of loss and damage are also quite strongly identified as those that are important to ensuring that climate finance actually is where we are building the pipeline for just transition projects that will, in fact, be the measures and the way in which we reach a low carbon economy that is inclusive and that is well financed to ensure that no one is left behind. So thank you very much. That is my brief presentation, and I am looking forward to engagements and more questions. My colleague Lebogang Mulaisi is also here, as I indicated, and she's quite ready to take any further questions if needs be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation and for sharing all those insights from the South Africa experience in terms of both the approach that was taken, but also the principles underpinning. And yeah, this last part on also exploring the areas of planning in terms, yes, of labor market, economic diversification, social support, governance, and climate finance, also in terms of the quality of finance needed. So now we have approximately 20 minutes for having a more interactive discussion. So I also invite the panels to start thinking and raising their hand if they have any questions. Maybe I'll start with two on which are two questions that we've been asking to all the different people in the hearings so far. So the first one is, we are really trying to think how a global just transition mechanism can be meaningful and can support the work that is already happening at national level. So the question is, what is your vision, or what are some of the features of this mechanism that you think could really make it meaningful and support your work, but also accelerate this transition work at national level? And in relation to that, also how you see potentially the Commission to participate, or what role you see, or what connection you would see between the Presidential Commission and such a mechanism. But I also see a hand from Kuda, so maybe we take that hand and then we can give the floor back. Kuda.
Yeah, thanks for Jessica. Dumelang, Talibanani, Boitumelo, Lebo. You should not be so shocked. I'm just from north of the Limpopo. So, these are basics for me. But thank you so much for such a great presentation. And because I'm from north of the Limpopo, I think I want to stretch your thinking on this issue to make it a bit more regional, and there's a reason for it. I strongly believe South Africa has got the best, at least on the continent right now, in terms of structures and thoughts around what just transition could look like. And Boitumelo, you mentioned the Gini coefficient, and a little known fact, the Gini coefficient of Southern Africa is actually the highest globally. And that's because of the structure of our economy, where it's based on mining. So basically we have a lot of rich people and a lot of poor people, effectively. So I wanted to ask you, how do we translate a lot of the great ideas coming out of South Africa into the rest, at least Southern Africa? Reason being, as you know, our economies are so interrelated. What would that kind of look like? Does it have to come from the governments, or as more of the labor organizations or civil society organizations, it has to come from that and hopefully maybe imprint in a global mechanism as being mentioned? So just some thoughts on that would be great to see if you have any ideas on that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kuda. I don't see further hands so far, so maybe we start with these questions and then we can open the floor again.
Yeah, so if I could maybe come in on Kuda's very important question. So Southern Africa is suffering from our historical context, the manner in which, resource extractive sort of economic activity has sort of been the backdrop of our economies for quite some time. And one of the things that is going to be important is how we think of the transition as an opportunity to restructure our economies. One of the biggest impediments, particularly for South Africa, and I think this is the same for Sub-Saharan Africa, is just concentrations of wealth. And to such an extent that it almost always keeps us in a cyclical environment of structural unemployment, poverty, and inequality as a result. So, I mean, especially in terms of the energy space, what we're starting to see is that through an energy transition, we can now talk about the entrance of smaller players as energy generators. I mean, there are ideological issues around, do you want decentralized energy generation, and how far do you want that divorced from the state? Those are conversations that need to happen, and I think mechanisms of this nature, where best practice from elsewhere in the world can help us sort of apply our mind around what's best for the sub-Saharan or South African case, right? Also taking into consideration that just transition practices are not a cut and paste. I think we're learning that the hard way here in South Africa. They're very much context specific. And they take into consideration the history of a country and whatever structural barriers sit in our way. Hence, Boitumelo made the presentation around the specific issues that are context specific to South Africa, which are not very different when we look at the southern region, really. So I think mechanisms of this nature, what they help us do, which is missing at a regional level, and I'm going to talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, is this idea around best practices. What we struggle with, and I think Boitumelo and myself struggled with this for quite some time, is that the examples that were strong were coming from the north. And when we were looking at replicating some of these, they were just too difficult to replicate in a South African context. But what we're now finding is that the South-South cooperation, the regional sort of integration issues are important for us to think about when applying our mind in terms of particularly structural challenges that we face when we talk about issues related to economic diversification and how we bring about smaller entrants, because the studies are telling us that in the transition, yes, there's a net positive job gains, but we need to understand that this is not necessarily within like multinational big companies. It's actually through smaller and medium enterprises. And we must also understand that it will even go to the point of, just the non-tradables as what we should be thinking about in terms of economic trade. So those are it's a long way to explain a very complicated issue, but those are the things that we found to be really useful, that the regional cooperation, especially when we take into consideration that trade intra-region is going to play a huge role, especially for economic diversification for the region more broadly. Around the question of what would be really useful in terms of like a global mechanism of this nature. So another thing that we're finding is that coordination is of critical importance, right? If more countries have the just transition as an agenda, what we're finding is it makes it easier for the discussions, it makes it easier for the interventions to move at a national level, because there's an understanding that each and every country is pushing towards this transition and doing it in a manner that is just. Of course, just differs from context to context, but the fact that we're all moving in this direction is really helpful. When we don't have this coordinated move forward, what then happens is fragmentation, right? And within the fragmentation, it's just a challenge in terms of how do we position interventions. We also need to understand that countries are prioritizing national sovereignty. They are prioritizing issues related to national competitiveness. They are prioritizing a number of national issues. a body of this nature, a mechanism of this nature, has to make the case that the sum total of all of these efforts is good for us globally. I think is what's important. I mean, South Africans are going to do what's practical at a national level. The global coordination, I think, is absolutely important, especially in an environment where there is a lot of polarization in terms of efforts towards either reaching the Paris Agreement, and a number of other UNFCCC sort of priorities. And then how the integration between national level bodies like the Presidential Climate Commission and a global mechanism could work in the interface. I think let's work on what's working, right? Let's continue to do what's working. So the fact that the Presidential Climate Commission here in South Africa is a multi-stakeholder body where it heavily listens to the views of various parties. I mean, Boitumelo has gone through a lot of effort talking about just a framework for a just transition in South Africa. That was a heavily consulted upon document so that at a national level, there's a unified vision of a just transition. I think that needs to be escalated at a global level, right? And that would be the intervention of a global mechanism. And then also just these issues related to the individual planning instruments, getting those practicalized at a global level is also of utmost importance, so that when we're doing our work at a national level, we can already start to see how this is taking shape elsewhere in the globe. I think it makes our work, our linkages, because what we're finding is that a lot of the things that we are able to achieve, we're doing that because we're learning lessons from elsewhere in the world. And it's even better if we can learn these lessons from countries that have some sort of similarities in terms of our national case. So I just wanted to provide that as just some examples to think about. I don't know, Jimmy, if you've got anything.
I think, Lebo, you've covered it quite well in that, I mean, you've contextualized it in terms of the mechanism in itself and how important it is that we're all on board. And what the South African framework shows is that finding some sort of consensus amongst the various constituencies is also important to push this, but also it also significantly elevates the issue of social dialogue. Social dialogue is quite critical, and I think in such a mechanism must be spelled out in its full to ensure that everyone that should be at the table is at the table, and that the most marginalized, including workers, women, youth, are at the table, and that considerations are being given to their lived experiences. That's very important to note. And I think another quite critical one, Lebo, and maybe I'm overly fixated on that, but it's also about predictable and scaled up finance, especially public finance. That's something that must be really spoken of, and that must be expressed through such mechanisms, because I think we are losing out on the actual implementation if we are not predicting how it should be spelled out. And when we call for predictable financing, we address a lot of issues, especially from the Global South perspective. While we have a lot of learnings internationally, and we could have some countries that are well advanced, the appreciation of the Global South experience, the Africa experience, I think must also be considered as something very critical when we try to find consensus internationally. And what this mechanism can do is elevate these issues for the Global South and Africa in its entirety. But I think you've handled that quite well. Thank you very much, Lebo.
Thank you so much for those. Great. Yeah, we have 10 more minutes for another short round. So Caroline.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I learned a lot, and I want to say I sit on Canada's, we also have a similar multi-stakeholder advisory body, and we consistently look to South Africa's Presidential Climate Change Commission as a leading light and best practice. So yeah, what an honor to learn from you this morning. I just wanted to build on one of the points you mentioned, Lebogang and Boitumelo as well, which is, the idea of bringing this concept of a social dialogue plus or multi-stakeholder advisory body to the UNFCCC through the mechanism. So just want to maybe hear you a little bit more about this. Would this be the idea of bringing representation from across the observer constituencies? What kind of voice and rights would you want to see these folks have into the process? As you can imagine, this is something Can is thinking about very intentionally, which is why I'm curious to hear you more on.
Thank you, Carol. Kuda, it's your hand.
Yeah, but I saw a question from Felicitas, so
Oh,
I'd prefer if we ask that. And then, do you want to read it out, or I should read it out?
Let's check. Felicitas, do you want me to read it or you want to come in? I can read it then. So Felicitas wanted to ask, what are the two key things each of you hope the mechanism would have that you think it might? And then, yeah, Kuda, add your last question, and then I think, oh, well, sorry,
Carmen can
Kuda,
go.
I'll pass it to
Yeah.
Carmen, so we do one each.
Yeah.
Carmen, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also thank you for the great presentation. As Caroline said, it was very informative. My question kind of goes into the direction of like international cooperation, because South Africa with the JETP, of course, had a lot of experience with international cooperation. And I would be very interested in hearing from your point of view how this mechanism should be set up for this international cooperation to actually advance national priorities, and also kind of reflecting on your experiences.
Yeah, Boitumelo is probably more free to speak about the JP more than I am. Yeah, when you're in the trade union, you can say a lot. But just to say this, I mean, I was in the trade unions when the sort of like the first announcement came around South Africa's involvement with the JP. Very important in the sense that it was a mechanism that could, start getting, broad sort of cooperation. And, we learned our lessons as South Africa there. But I think with this mechanism, there would be a leveled playing field. So with the JP, you have one small emerging country striking basically a deal with these big powerhouses, and that can skew things. So with the mechanism of this nature, where it has a number of players and there's better coordination, I think that can level the playing field a bit, so that the funding in question is directed to where it's needed most, right? And it can unlock the just element of the transition. What we're seeing in the financing is that a lot of domestic financing on climate is already going towards funding mitigation projects. So that usually takes care of itself. The banks are well aware of what they need to finance. Mechanisms of this nature could help us generate more funding for adaptation priorities and more funding for issues that are just, so healthcare, education, and just a lot of issues that help us in terms of the social aspects of the just transition. And I think a mechanism of this nature can help us then get to those types of discussions. I mean, I think we're in South Africa, we're beyond the whole concept of financing bankable projects, but more financing for social impact now, right? And these are the things, by the way, that get you traction with society, so that society can buy into your just transition agenda. So mechanisms of this nature can help us to now get towards that point. Not that I'm rubbishing the JP experience. It was very important for South Africa. It moved us along in the right direction. And it got us to build important institutions and to get them in place. But now I think we're building on the momentum of that to get us to more financing for the just and equitable part of our transition. I think, Caroline, your question around composition, it's not that we've figured it out ourselves, right? In fact, in our Climate Change Act, to get out of it, we just stipulated one stakeholder that must always be in the conversation, and it's just local government, because the implementation is at local government level. And then we pass the buck to the president to say, you figure out the composition. But South Africa has a strong social dialogue, history and culture. And it's always been centered around, workers, communities, government, as well as business organization. But the PCC has come into the culture of extending that to youth groups, faith-based organizations, to sort of broaden the scope quite a bit. So I don't know what the composition is going to look like. It's a contested space, but the idea is following a mapping exercise of some sort, and trying to make sure that those that are at risk and those that are vulnerable are the ones that you are speaking to and giving a voice. Is probably some of the things that we found to be quite useful. But another mechanism that the PCC uses, even if you are not at the table per se as an appointed commissioner, we work on a highly transparent model. All meetings are live streamed, so that type of active participation, even though you are not a commissioner per se, has been quite valuable, especially for the South African discussions around the just transition. Dumi, I don't know if you want to take.
I think it's quite important that we have people like you that come from trade unions then transition into these roles, because you express the trade unions' interest quite eloquently. And I think when you address the question of who must be at the table, it's quite clear. These are people that are most impacted, and they include workers quite strongly. And while you can't speak freely on the JET-P or the JET-IPs in the iterations, I think it's important that this mechanism doesn't follow through with what happened in the JET-P. Because what we saw was an escalation of more debt, which we cautioned against as the trade union, to say that this can't be another exercise to further indebt countries like South Africa that are transitioning to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. But it's also important that we really think about the composition and who's at the table, but also not have them there as tokens. We need meaningful participation and engagement with the identified people that are there at the negotiation table for this mechanism, are not just there because it's Boitumelo from Tungo and we've ticked a box. This needs to be someone that is given the adequate time and adequate resources to be able to engage and present the interests of the constituency. So if there's someone from UNGO, they need to be there, identified, and also given the platform to express what the needs and interests of UNGO are, the needs and interests of Tungo are, and also make sure that this mechanism is creating a space where we are able to move to a inclusive and low carbon economy at the end of things. So this mechanism cannot be another means to which we are ticking boxes, or we are wanting to achieve whatever else parties want to achieve. It's important that all observers under the UNFCCC banner, as well as the parties, are at the table and are negotiating in good faith to ensure that this mechanism not only benefits the process towards a just transition, but also benefits the people on the ground. And I think Lebogang covers the issue of making sure that the finance is actually touching those that are actually in need of that climate finance going forward. Localization, I think Lebo also covers quite eloquently. But I think this mechanism is one that we, as Tungo, and I appreciate the fact that the ITUC at the level of international engagements is quite strongly lobbying behind this mechanism. So it must be seen as one that we're bringing to the table in collaboration with civil society, of course, to ensure that all observers are represented, are seen, are heard, and a part of this bigger discourse towards a just transition. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so just on the last one, to me, there was a question around what do we not want this mechanism to be? Another talk shop. So like in South Africa, well, let me speak for what I know. You know, we're in a scenario where we are looking at this transition as our opportunity for industrialization, economic development, while achieving our climate targets, and just overall having a low carbon economy and a resilient one at that. So for us, mechanisms, I mean, I see people who are like career negotiators. I hope we're not creating another structure that kind of like does that, but, you know, start to like drive the real implementation. Because we also need to understand that we've been touting the idea of a just transition for a while. And with at-risk vulnerable groups, we're starting to lose traction with them because they're just not seeing the implementation and they're not feeling anything tangible. So structures of this nature have to drive the tangible benefits. So when Boitumelo is talking about the quality of finance, that it's not debt finance, but it is, you know, finance that does flow to the global south, that doesn't have strings attached and actually drives development. That stuff is important. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you so much, and very well said. And thank you so much for all the insights. I don't think we really have the time to do a proper summary that will not do justice to the richness of the discussions, but maybe wrapping up, I just wanted to highlight a couple of elements. But yeah, we captured everything that was shared. Yeah, I mean, starting from how the mechanism could indeed bring in this important element of coordination, and having more countries having just transition on the agenda makes it easier to advance just transition also at national level. How I really liked this notion of how the mechanism can actually make the case that the subtotal of all the single efforts is good for us globally, especially, as you said, in an environment when there is a lot of polarization and a crisis of multilateralism. And then indeed, how we could use the mechanism to also elevate issues of inclusion, social dialogue, participation, and very well said, not in a tokenistic approach, but in a real approach in which the people that need to be there are and have a seat at the table. And then, again, how the mechanism should indeed serve to elevate issues that are important for the global south. You mentioned predictable and scaled-up finance, but yeah, we also heard economic diversification and wider issues under international cooperation, and also, how the mechanism could serve to level the playing field vis-a-vis what we see sometimes as donor-driven agendas that, maybe further increase debt and not really tackle the just part. So how the mechanism could serve to level that field and unlock the just part of the transition. But with that, we have reached the end of this session. I really, really wanted to thank Boitumelo and Lebogang for joining us and for sharing these incredible insights and lessons from the South Africa experience. In 8 minutes, we'll have the next hearing with the Just Transition Observatory. So for the audience that is following us online, this live will end now, and you can refresh the Can International YouTube page to access the new hearing at the hour. So yeah, with that, I thank Boitumelo, Lebogang, and our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.